Okay, we're live.
We're live.
So I'm so excited to be here today with Mike Abrams. Mike was on the podcast two weeks ago, last week.
Yeah.
Yeah.
2 weeks ago.
So I had the brilliant idea to have him come on and answer some questions live. So here we are, and we get lots of questions about management agreements. We have a bunch of them from the Facebook group and from some of my own members of my flight group program. So I am going to pull those out and pose them to Mike, but please also say hello and put any additional questions in the comments on the Facebook field, and then we'll see them come in on our end. So before I start, Mike, just give us a little bit of, we did this on the podcast a little bit, but for anybody who hasn't listened to yet, God forbid anybody's not completely up to speed, do an intro and then we'll dive in.
So I came to Coworking through, I guess, a different angle than most. I've been in real estate for 25 years. So I've been a developer. I built ground up, existing, office, retail, residential, and I got into co-working several years ago and love the concept and think that the future is very, very bright today. And it's time to be planning.
Oh, good. We love that. Okay. And I think sort of the management agreement, joint venture, the collaboration with the landlord is something a lot of folks are thinking about now as we've kind of managed through COVID, and people were thinking about that beforehand, but now we're going to have operators giving back space, landlords with space they want to make flexible. There's a lot of opportunities for conversations for, sort of partnering and making the approach work for both sides. So, Mike, I'm going to pose the questions that I have here. Sure. So let me just grab my doc. So this is, I can see how this might apply to a traditional lease, and I'm not sure about a management agreement, but I'm going to ask you anyway.
Okay.
So the question is, due to COVID, how might a management agreement contain a provision for a government mandated temporary business closure?
So here's the great thing about the management agreement is it puts the burden not on the operator, but on the landlord. So again, the management agreement provides the maximum flexibility for the landlord. So if it is an essential business, they can still stay open. As a matter of fact, today with technology and the key fobs and everything else, many, as we all know, operators have maintained being open if they were essential personnel. So that part does not change.
I think, though, in reality, while operators have not been forced to put locks on the doors, right, and the other kind of provision for staying open is that many operators process commercial mail. So that allowed them to technically stay open. What would the discussion be like with the landlord when you're operating under a management agreement, right, when effectively, right, there's a close down and nobody's coming in?
So I'm going to give you a great example. I had a conversation this morning with a friend of mine who is a member of a co-working space in Bethesda, Maryland. I'm going to keep it nameless for now, but he was paying his rent, believe it or not, and he had gone in July and August. Little did he know, come October 1st, he got a call from the operator that says, the shop is closed, we're being squeezed out, everyone needs to leave. So this is an operator that signed a lease, and apparently they weren't paying their rent. The landlord said, you have to pay or you're out. And so while the operator tried to maintain the establishment with the members, unfortunately, they weren't able to work out a deal with the landlord. And all of a sudden, everybody's out. So now take that to a management agreement. believe it or not, it is in the best interest of the landlord to keep everybody there. And he owns the space and he relies on the operator to generate that income. So you are literally under a management agreement. You are a true partner. While the landlord is relying on you in a pandemic where everyone is being forced to work from home and work remotely, we all know everyone's going through an economic hardship. He's not going to close that down. As a matter of fact, he'll do everything in his power to maintain that operation and maintain the memberships. So I know in a lot of other management deals that are existing today, they cut their membership fees down to like 50% or even less. So there's much more flexibility in times like now when you're under a management agreement and the operator isn't going through their financial distress. So that's great as compared to the traditional lease where you're playing that rent arbitrage game. That doesn't exist right now.
And Mike, one of the important points that you made when we talked was that it's super important when, obviously this has to happen to get to an agreement. Lots of landlords don't understand our business model, right? How do we make money? How does a co-working space work? And so when you're in a situation where you don't have that relationship and the landlord isn't peeking under the hood and understanding, how the business works, they're not going to be in a position to sort of, maybe dig in and figure out like what the options are. Whereas when you're sitting on the same side of the table, they understand that some revenue is better than no revenue and they've experienced that revenue coming in and maybe there's a profit share, however that's worked. So they've already seen some fluctuation and then it's okay, how do we, make the best of the situation versus not understanding the model and just kind of shutting down and saying either pay the rent or go.
Well, the one thing landlords do understand, and that's money and cash flow.
Right. And so if they have access and visibility into that cash flow, they know how to make decisions about what to do next. Yep. But if they've never looked at your P&L and they just want the check,
and the interesting thing is today, what they don't understand is the algorithms behind the Google search and how operators generate their leads. Yeah. Because the old school mentality was you engage a broker and you get a tenant, you negotiate a lease and all that stuff. So you put that aside today and all of a sudden you're generating leads electronically. Like, a lot of landlords don't get that. However, I will tell you the caveat is a lot of landlords today are in different investment types. So this office management model is no different than the residential model. It's very, very similar to apartments. You're hiring an operator to do the leasing, the management, the operations. You get a check every month. You send them the variance report. That way they can tell, are they satisfying the budget? Are they below? Are they exceeding? And even today, this, Jamie, there's the leads are still being generated, even though a lot of members are reluctant to go back. The leads are there.
Yeah, they're starting to be pipeline, and those leads that the landlord would not have access to. Correct. And not to make this into a pitch for management agreements, but when the landlord understands the model and understands, lead gen and how that works, and they can see sort of a light at the end of the tunnel through the operating partner versus maybe having no leads from their broker, right? Yep. In a time like this. Yep. I have a super tactical question, and then we have a couple of questions in the comments just related to this woman's question who asked, would there be a provision for this in the management agreement? I suspect there wouldn't be a specific provision because the incentives would be drawn up to align so that the two parties would work through this together and decide how to proceed. But in a situation where there's a management fee and no profit share, or maybe there's a profit share that swings to the landlord because they've paid for the build out, would one put a provision about the management fee, in given sort of a pandemic or a forced closure? Because I could see the concern being, okay, operator relies on the management fee for income. Business is effectively closed. Does that management fee go away? And so there's effectively no income for the operator. Now the operator is not writing checks out of their, own bank account for the rent, but any thoughts on that?
I would say that is all open for discussion. The pandemic has clearly affected everybody. So, you're not generating the income, therefore you're not satisfying your budget. Yeah, it puts you in a precarious situation. However, it's not like the landlord can backfill that space with a tenant either.
Yeah.
So more than likely, he's in a better position today to move forward with that manager and go back to work on releasing the space.
All right, we are gonna put Heidi's question up.
Yep.
So they vary widely. Is there an industry standard for operator revenue split with the landlord? This might be a long answer.
So in most management deals, an operator will be getting two sources of income. One is the management fee, and the management fee, while operators like to establish that upfront on a monthly basis, sometimes the landlord will come back and say, I don't feel comfortable. I made all this investment. I want to get my money before you get yours. And, early on to get up to stabilization, I'm not hitting my numbers. So what if we do a percentage? So a lot of landlords and a lot of operators, because let's face it, if you outperform the pro forma, having a percentage of that revenue could exceed the management fee. But when it comes to the revenue split, so how is that established? In most cases, not every, but in most cases, the landlord is looking to get market rents. So let's say a building is, they're leasing at $20 a square foot, full service. So you want to get to that number. When you exceed that number, in theory, that's the profit share part. So let's say you get to $25. You have $5 of profit, and therefore that would be split. Sometimes, I'd say most times, it starts off 50-50. But at the same time, it's probably to an advantage to the operator to do some type of stair step, because if it's possible where you can add on revenue or increase the revenue over time, it might be beneficial where that 50% goes to 60% when you hit a certain number. And, depending on where you are in the market, are you partnering up in a Class A building or a B or a C building? Those numbers are going to change drastically. I highly recommend, while the A buildings are great and they're very, very attractive, it's hard to get to those profit sharing numbers because they're very onerous, and then you're having to charge very high membership fees.
Partly because of the cost of the build out. Exactly. So that makes sense. Heidi, let us know if there's a follow up there. Okay. Let's see. So question from Kim. I know one big upside to present to a building owner, if you're sort of pitching, a management agreement approach, is that co-working brings vibrancy to the building and it increases the overall value of the property. I don't know if you, sort of tell this story. Are there stats about this, or sort of a way to prove that?
Yes. I mean, it's all in the cash flow and the net operating income. As a matter of fact, I would take that a step further, because when you're exceeding the market rents, it's going to show on the bottom line. But truly, the best thing that can happen from a co-working operation is you get organic growth, meaning members start growing, they start doing well. All of a sudden, they need their own space. Maybe they do want to sign a lease. So therefore, that landlord will be the beneficiary of that member staying in the building, but relocating out of the space to their own space. And then you backfill it with new members. All of a sudden, that increase in value is significant. And I say that because the landlord is spending less capital up front to satisfy that member's growth. Yeah, it shows up very, very early in the game.
And saving on broker fees, et cetera.
Yep.
Yeah. So hard to sort of prove whether that will happen, but you could sort of put some numbers on paper that would say, look, in this scenario, these are the benefits that you would see. Yeah. She had a follow-up question. She would love this. We'll see if we can tackle this. A deeper understanding of the cost benefit analysis to the owner. Like, is there a sort of a simple story on when this is a sort of a no-brainer for an owner, or when is an owner most incented to take the management agreement approach versus looking for a market rate lease?
Well, it's interesting. So in a lot of circumstances that I've been involved with, I will meet with landlords. I make the introduction. We have a discussion. They've had vacancy in their building for years, meaning they're generating zero income. And they say, but we have spec suites. And I said, but this isn't spec suites. Co-working is a true business model where you totally reactivate the building. You reactivate all the tenants amongst members. You create activity through amenities, through programming, through events. And it's really a matter of putting the numbers to the paper. Every landlord knows they have to make the capital investment upfront. They would make that capital investment for a traditional lease. They would be required. What they don't have to do for co-working that they have to do for the traditional tenant under a lease is they have to provide rent concessions. They have to pay a broker. Depending on how soft the market is or what the supply and demand is, they might have to give additional free rent. In a lot of cases in markets, you have to give a year's free rent with a traditional lease, So a lot of times,
you and Casey have chatted, and Casey will absolutely ask for a year because of the ramp up time. But for the building owner, the ramp up time may not mean zero revenue for him, right? It just may mean not quite market rent. But so if you put it in a spreadsheet, it's still better off.
Well, when you put it in a spreadsheet and you talk to almost any landlord, you take a 10-year lease, from the free rent, the tenant improvement allowance, the broker's commission, what other capital that they have to invest, they will tell you they probably don't even break even until about year 5 and 6 of the term.
You made that point when we talked on the podcast, and that was an interesting number to me.
Well, that's why you don't see landlords doing 3 and 5 year deals right now.
Yeah, it simply doesn't pencil.
It doesn't pencil out. And when you look at the co-working and what it can do for a building, it literally energizes the building. It brings it back to life. And you've seen this. I've seen this. Everyone on the podcast sees this. It's just a different mindset. And once landlords catch on, you will see this transformation from the leases to the management deals.
Though I want to make a quick point, and I know this is not what you're thinking because you told me some of the buildings you're looking at. We don't want to do a management agreement with a desperate landlord with an unattractive asset.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
We want to do a management agreement in a building that is attractive to us for a, in a lease situation potentially, and kind of hits all the check marks. I'll stop yapping because we have some more questions. Heidi had a follow-up. Is the operator responsible for all operating expenses less rent?
So in a management agreement, you have to remember there's really not rent per se. You're looking first on the operation. So your operating margins more than likely are going to be very strong, maybe 60% or more.
Because there's no rent in the, assuming
you don't have the free rent, you don't have anything. So you're literally, from that first member, and so on, there's income. But yes, there comes a point where you still have to pay the salaries, you have to pay the rent, not the rent, the operating expenses. That will all come out from the cash flow. So typically that first year, there's a negative because depending on the size of the space, most of the spaces that I'm looking at are in the 12,000 plus range square feet. So it takes a little while, roughly 40 plus offices. It takes a little while to get to the stabilization. So with that negative, yes, the landlord would absorb that.
So if I'm interpreting Heidi's question right, and tell me if I've got this right, but oftentimes in a management agreement, so there's a sort of a working capital operating budget account, and the expenses all come out of that account, including staff and whatnot, and the management fee, if there is one, would be an expense line.
Correct.
So sometimes, again, every deal is different, but one might negotiate that as long as, maybe even from day one, there's a management fee, whether the operation's profitable or not, because to your point, that could take a year. I run a program called the Coworking Startup School. I want people to say maybe it's 18 months, depending on the size of the space, to get it to your kind of ongoing occupancy rate. And so the profit share is what would be sort of below the expense line. So expenses get paid, and then if there's a profit, that's when you're deciding what to split. But the management fee, is not going to be life-changing, but it would be in there, and it would be, paying for your time, because you're marketing the space, you're managing the staff, you're doing all the things. And the marketing, expenses would be part of those operating expenses, and there would be a pre-launch budget for that, et cetera. Perfect. So, Kim, would you say management agreements are most attractive for landlords of larger office buildings?
Before you even discuss the actual size of the building, I think you have to look at the location of the building, especially today where the market is more attracted to suburban locations. So the key to that is it convenient to get to, accessible? Is there free parking? And can I walk to the amenities to grab lunch, to grab a coffee? More than likely, a coffee is going to be in the space. But if it's in a mixed-use project where it's live, work, and play, that's fantastic. Everybody loves them. It's all. You also have to think about it at the end of the workday. Is there anywhere to grab a dinner, grab a cocktail, whatever? That really adds value to that asset. Assuming that's there, whether it's large or small, I think early on in the co-working game, everyone was talking about the percentage of co-working in a building. Okay, so initially that number was in the 15 to 20% range. I think today, with the acceleration of co-working, I see that percentage going possibly even higher. It could be as much as 30 to 40%. And I think it's because, to the previous question about adding value, that value is going to be added. And through what is now transpiring in the office market, I see the value of co-working exceeding the traditional leases because of what is currently happening where they're backing out of leases, they're trying to sublease space. I mean, it's one thing if a landlord is getting paid and the space is dark. It's another thing if nobody's in the building. The one thing that we all know from co-working, because you have a lot of members and in different businesses, they keep the building active. A lot of them are working 24/7. They're working over the weekend. You might have programming events and you're bringing a lot of people together. It adds value to the space over the long run.
And I think, Mike, the size of the building, to your point about the sort of 20% ceiling, is really traditionally a lender issue, right?
Yeah.
Like the lender, so the banks where they get their financing doesn't want to see more than 20% of the building on variable income.
Yep.
And so that was always sort of the limitation. And I think a lot of people have this hypothesis, and we don't know yet, but that the lenders are going to have to just move on that a little bit, because and again, this is all such a like evolving scene, because to your point, there are plenty of tenants who are still paying, right? They're not there, but they're paying because they're high credit, bigger companies, but they're going to get out when they can. And so some of this cycle will take some time. And then the demand from the tenant is around flexibility and smaller spaces. And so the lenders, I've heard this, beyond what you just said, is we'll have to sort of go along with what the market is demanding finally. And that still may take years, right? That could be 3 to 5 years down the road. But I think, Kim, that's maybe why we think of management agreements in larger buildings, is because if, not everyone can get funding to do a build out for a 10,000 square foot building that's going to be all co-working. So if they can't get that approval from their lender, they can't do it, which is why a bigger building may be able to get approval more easily.
And plus, I think co-working does work better in larger buildings where you can literally reactivate the entire building.
And you can see the advantages around, moving tenants out, having them expand. Makes sense. Just making sure I'm not missing. Okay, so we had some questions in the Facebook group. Let me. Amanda had a question. The biggest perk for managing versus owning or operating. Are there a couple of examples? You don't have to, name names, but kind of for you, like what's in the, the pro bucket for doing a management agreement versus signing a direct lease?
Well, I mean, God, if I'm an operator, it's simple. I don't want that financial burden up front, not only to have that contingent liability of the lease on my shoulders, but depending on how that lease is negotiated, I don't want to have to pay for the FF&E. I don't want to have to pay for all that, because let's face it, there's significant risk involved. If I did my homework, I'm looking at the competition. I'm looking at, who else is going to enter the market. I have to be aware of, rents. Does my space, is it providing more than my competitors? Signing a lease sounds great initially, but I got to tell you, especially now in this pandemic, we see the downside of it's obvious. You have this liability, the landlord can come after you. The relationship that a landlord has with a tenant is so significant from a legal and financial standpoint, as compared to a management agreement. You're a partner with the landlord. You're speaking on a regular basis, whereas in the landlord and the tenant relationship, they rarely speak unless something is wrong. Whereas we know co-working, it's engaging. We engage the members daily. They love it. The community manager loves it. you have such a different relationship, and it affects the operation. I truly believe the management model is something we're going to see everybody move to that. If they haven't already, they will be. I just hate seeing anyone today contemplate doing a lease because it's so difficult to play that rent arbitrage game, that spread between what you're paying the landlord and what you're able to get. It's a lot of work. And if you're a partner with the landlord, it just makes a lot easier. And I think over the long run, if you're doing your job right, not only are you going to make management fees, you're going to get the profit sharing, and it's going to be significantly better. Your return will be better over the long run, considering you have less financial risk in the game.
It's a longer game though.
Yeah.
Because if the profits of the business are going to pay back the build out, which to some extent under a lease, they're doing that anyway.
and the real issue at the end of the day, it's all about getting to stabilization. No matter what the size is, whether it's 10,000 square feet or 30,000 square feet, to get to stabilization, that's the true risk. It's the risk for the operator. It's the risk for the landlord. If you have the ability to take that burden off your shoulders, you can do it with a management agreement. You might not make, your numbers maybe month 1, 2, and 3, but, depending on the time of the year, but let's say 1 month you exceed your projections. And then the next month you exceed your projections. And then all of a sudden, you feel good. The burden's been lifted. The landlord loves you. You're sending them checks. You're making the management fee. And then when you finally hit those market rents and you start exceeding it at stabilization, all of a sudden, you guys are the best friends.
You are best friends, but you're still giving half of so less capital investment up front. For those who are maybe more entrepreneurial and want the risk,
right?
If you have access to the capital, there are still people who will sign leases all day long,
right,
or do a hybrid.
Right.
So I think the challenge with the management agreement is you need more locations because.
And the one thing we haven't discussed that some operators do is they buy their own buildings.
Yeah, and that was part of the question.
And I fully support that. I think that is, we know Novel has been doing that, and it's very, very successful.
Yeah.
Because the operator benefits from the organic growth.
Right. Totally. Yeah. And Novel's kind of a big player example. They'll take, 50,000 square feet, but I have probably half of my startup school students own their building.
Yep.
And it gives them a lot more leverage over time.
Yep. Okay. A lot more flexibility, and it's easier to work with lenders too.
And the management agreement takes out broker fees, but there's obviously a lot of work to get the agreement in place, which is why Mike and I were talking about templates. I said my theory about why there are no templates out there is because people are paying their attorneys hefty amounts, tens of thousands of dollars, because every agreement is so custom, essentially, right? Based on the terms.
Yep.
Who pays for working out the agreement? And how do brokers get involved in that process?
So brokers, are you talking about, I'm assuming we're talking about leasing brokers?
Yes.
Okay. So the management agreement itself is the burden of the operator. Okay. So that's probably one thing that they will pay, because they will provide that to the landlord and say, here's our deal. The management agreement is basically, it formulates the relationship between the landlord and the operator, what they're going to be doing, what they're going to be providing, what's the landlord going to be doing. The one thing you haven't asked yet is, what's the skin in the game from the operator? That will be spelled out in the management agreement, and it could be a lot of different things. The issue with brokers, and as a landlord and a developer, we love brokers, but our leads for co-working are typically generated through Google search. So we really don't pay brokers. What we do for our operators, however, we do provide a commission for our community managers bringing those leads in, and they typically, and it's very, very similar to the residential market. They get half of that first month's rent. It's really, really simple. So we do this, we do this all the time.
I think what Kim may be asking is maybe, sort of that matchmaking challenge that you and I have talked about. If Kim's working with a broker, but she's interested in a management agreement and the broker can't get paid if she does a management agreement, is she finding the landlord on her own?
So I do that as well. Every case is different. I have gotten paid by the operator, and I've also gotten paid by the landlord. It really, as the facilitator and procuring calls, matchmaking, it's great. It's great for the operator. It's great for the landlord. But at the same time, you got to protect yourself. That broker, I think, I'm seeing it in companies like Avison Young, classic example. Giovanni and his team, they do that. Whereas other brokerage companies might have, like CBRE has their own co-working group. So sometimes brokers might have a conflict of interest.
Aligned, right.
So, you just have to be careful about, who is that broker serving? Are they serving the landlord? Are they serving the operator? I think we're going to see this more and more now because of the vacancies, and the sublet market is rapidly expanding in every market right now. So I do see a role for the broker, but you just have to protect yourself.
You have to manage that. And speaking of which, Mike, I will ask you when we're done contact info. So if folks want to follow up with you, ask you questions. This is something, you do and have a lot of expertise in, clearly. So we'll make sure we put that in the contact info or in the comments, whatever you're willing to share. Okay. Kim said exactly. She's responding affirmatively. Okay. I'm going to pick one more question here from our Facebook posts.
Sure.
Are there key articles or elements that every management agreement should include?
Wow.
I know, that's a long one.
That might take an hour.
Exactly. I need to do. We would do a class on that.
Because you have to think about things like insurance. Insurance is critical, because the other thing is, one thing for discussion is the FF&E. Who pays for the FF&E? Again, that is up for discussion. I would say if you're doing a management model, I would always try to avoid the upfront cost and absorb that within your budget and your operations and finance it over 5 years. And that way your budget can afford it. It's simple. There's some great opportunities out there. And you can negotiate great deals right now.
One question from Heidi. Heidi and her husband are one of my students, and they have a management agreement opportunity. Who is funding the losses until you're profitable?
Oh, the landlord.
That's part of the agreement, right?
Yep.
There's an operating budget, and the landlord, while it is a partnership, the landlord will start to get anxious if that wrap up time is slower than projected. So there is there are reporting requirements. I mean, it's definitely, you have to think about that in advance.
Yep. You do.
You have a partner, they're kind of a boss because they own the asset and they control the bank account.
Right, right. And the other thing is, that's always a function of how much money you're willing to pay Google for those ad searches. So as we know, the big national guys, because they have to get like 30% pre-lease, they're going to spend an enormous amount of money that more than likely Kim and her husband can't afford. I can't afford. So we try to get, something that's more cost effective. It's a trial and error, and you have to play around with that.
Yeah. Which is another reason, again, the sort of the lease versus management agreement discussion, there are arguments for kind of you need to get your feet under you and show that you know how to operate a business. And the landlord's going to be much more comfortable if you can show experience on a ramp up, and be more convincing that you know how long that might take and the levers to pull. Here's what we do for ads. Here's what we do in the, local market to start selling.
Yeah. The worst thing is for those leads not coming in. Then I will say I don't know anyone that has experienced that. I think then the true hard part is converting those leads to membership licenses. And that's the key, is getting a high percentage of that. It's, when they walk through the door for the tour, don't let them leave without making a deal. That's what you do.
Convert.
Yeah.
Sarah asked a quick follow-up. She says, late to the party, what is FF&E? Furniture, fixtures, and equipment. So chairs, tables.
That's the tables and chairs. It's for the conference rooms, the phone booths, the meeting rooms, the open desks, everything.
It's movable. Anything that you could pick up and take with you if you left this.
It's the second largest capital investment, second only to the interior improvements.
Yep. Perfect. Okay. Mike, I'm going to wrap us because we've been going for 40 minutes now.
Great.
So we might have to do this again. We had some good questions and I think some follow-up questions. So thank you. A big thank you for sharing your experience.
Thank you.
Your expertise.
Loved all the questions. They were great.
Yeah. And I will put Mike's contact info in the comments once I clear with him what he wants to share in the comments. Anybody who wants to follow up. Thanks for the great questions, and we'll see you next week.
Great. Thanks. Appreciate it.